Okay. Hello, everyone. Let me start with one important remark before we continue. It concerns our viewers on YouTube. So links to all the materials we will mention in today's discussion and in Professor Brandom's talk will be available in the description below this video. So let me introduce myself. I'm Ivan Vashenko, philosopher and translator, lecturer at American University Kiev, and editor-in-chief of the recently founded publishing house Synthesa. Let me continue by introducing our today's speaker, Professor Robert Brandom, whom I met in 2018 in Pittsburgh, where I went as a Fulbright visiting scholar to do my research on Wilfrid Sellars' philosophy. And I went to Pittsburgh because I considered Brandom as one of the world's leading Sellars scholars. And I freely admit that at that time I hadn't read Making It Explicit yet, although I knew, of course, about this book. Probably I was so impressed and mesmerized by Sellars' influential essay, Inference and Meaning, that I didn't expect someone to systematically develop ideas Sellars so ingeniously presented there. But then Professor Brandom invited me to participate in his class on Robert Brandom's philosophy. And he did in the winter term of 2018. And then I discovered a whole new world of normative pragmatics and inferential semantics. So this is how I met Bob Brandom. Now, Professor Brandom started his academic career in 1976 by defending, needless to say, successfully his doctoral dissertation entitled Practice and Object at Princeton University. His doctoral advisors were David Lewis, like prominent US philosophers, David Lewis and Richard Rorty. Rorty, by the way, is probably the most read and known US philosopher of the 20th century in Ukraine. So after the defense of the dissertation, Professor Brandom started teaching philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh, first as assistant professor, then as associate professor, then as full professor, and since 2007 as distinguished professor. While teaching in Pittsburgh, Brandom wrote his opus magnum, Making It Explicit. But I have to add that Brandom is known not only because of his systematic contribution to the philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, and epistemology, but also as an original interpreter of modern philosophy. His most important works on this topic are Tales of the Mighty Dead and A Spirit of Trust, a reading of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. It was like a long-awaited book on Hegel's work published in 2019. And actually, I was lucky enough in the spring term 2019 to participate in class of Professor John McDowell, Brandom's colleague at the University of Pittsburgh, which was dedicated exactly to Brandom's reading of Phenomenology of Spirit, and it was quite a thought-provoking class. So please welcome Professor Robert Brandom. And now let me introduce you to our project and to my students who actually doing this project. And this is a 2-volume edition entitled Neo-Pragmatism, Neo in brackets. So the idea behind this whole project emerged from my course, Philosophies of the Enlightenment, which I taught last year at Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. And actually I used your essay, The Pragmatist Enlightenment, as I would say, as a blueprint to prepare for that course. Even so, and I will mention it in our discussion. Now, just in passing, I disagree with you in limiting the first, as you called it, the first enlightenment to the practical sphere of morality. So I started this course with classical British empiricism, discussed then French Enlightenment, then Vicos and Rousseau's philosophy, and finished my account of this first enlightenment with Kant's project of perpetual peace as the climax of Enlightenment's political philosophy. And then I discussed anti-enlightenment, so to say Schopenhauer in epistemology, Marxism in political philosophy, and British utilitarianism in ethics. And, which is most important, I finished the whole course by discussing the Pittsburgh School of Philosophy as as I put it, the neo-Enlightenment. And I pointed out that Pittsburgh philosophers improved, so to say, classical British empiricism by combining it with the classical German philosophy. And in doing so, they closed, so to say, the cycle by dealing with the major weakness of British empiricism, its epistemology. So the idea of this two-volume edition with the first Ukrainian translations of American pragmatists and neo-pragmatists is to situate American pragmatism in the larger, broader context of European intellectual history, connecting it with the heritage of the First Enlightenment. So all the translations in this volume were done. Not everyone actually has finished their work, but still were done by the students of my class in the translator school within the private cultural institution Mizhvuchama, roughly translated from Ukrainian between years. So this school does a great job facing the biggest challenge of our culture, Ukrainian culture, namely the need for translations of significant philosophical classics in Ukrainian. So for the first volume, we collected essays by Charles Sanders Peirce. Even so here in Ukraine, this last name of Peirce is pronounced as Pierce. And I don't know why. That's why we were discussing something in Pittsburgh when you actually pronounced his last name as Peirce. I didn't get immediately actually who you were talking about, but still, okay, in the first volume, it's Peirce, James, and Dewey. In the second volume, Sellers, Quine, Davidson, Rorty, and Brandom. So I will introduce each of my students who actually did the translations of each philosopher. So Peirce's essays translated Volodymyr Kuch. Volodymyr is a trained translator, and Volodymyr, you can say all the essays you translated.
Hi, Mr. Brandom. I translated the essays, like 4 essays, how to make our ideas clear. His, I would say, classic one, what is a sign, what pragmatism is, and the issues of the pragmatism. Yes.
Okay. Thanks. And probably you can say something about the difficulties you faced by translating those essays.
Well, I'm not a scholar of philosophy. I am just pure translator. And my experience before this school of philosophical translation was just translating fiction, like books of American and English authors. And thanks to Ivan, I can call myself now a beginner in this type of translation, and I'm quite excited in this field of work, excited about working on these texts. And yeah, it was quite difficult because it requires much higher level of research, much higher level of understanding of the texts, but I hope I did well.
Oh, yeah. But you know, Bob, I'm not sure if you would agree, but in the case of Peirce, you need also an experience of translating fiction sometimes, because some of his essays are just puzzling. Okay.
Well, I think that's a good set of choices of essays to do. That really is the core. So.
Yeah, thank you. So William James's essays translated from essays in radical empiricism from that collection translated Mykola Fedya. Mykola is a doctoral student in philosophy at Institute of Philosophy of National Academy of Sciences in Ukraine. So Mykola, can you tell us about your experiences?
Yes, and I'm also associate researcher at the Polish Institute of Philosophy, so in collaboration. So yes, I translate 2 of the articles by William James of his collection and essays of radical empiricism. The first article is Does Consciousness Exist? And the second one is A World as Pure Experience. And for me, actually, I study, my topic of research is Latin scholastic philosophy. And for me, William James and his style is rather interesting and very unusual for me, yes. But nevertheless, it is very interesting and his ideas, but the style is rather interesting and unusual.
Okay.
It is. I mean, of those classic figures, James was by far the best writer, and the only one that one might suggest could be a model for contemporary philosophical style. So James is a great model.
Okay, unfortunately, another my student, Sabina, who actually translated Dewey, she probably couldn't join us because she is now in Melbourne, if I'm not mistaken, and because of this time difference, probably she couldn't join us, but okay. So, okay, this is the first volume, Pragmatism, and like the second volume. For the second volume, as I've already told you, I will improve my translation of Quine's Two Dogmas of Empiricism, and I'm going to translate also Sellars' crucial essay, Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man. So basically this, and then, okay, Anna Maria Kotlerova, she translated Davidson's essays. She actually is, she majored in philosophy at the National University of Kiev-Mohyla Academy here in Kiev, and she is also co-founder of this publishing house, Synthesa. By the way, she translated also Wittgenstein's remarks on colors, Bemerkungen über die Farben. We will publish it also this year. So Anna Maria, tell us what you've done.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Professor Brandom. Well, yeah, I was translating Davidson's Radical Interpretation and Thought and Talk. Well, I guess I faced the very same problems as in each and every translation of philosophical texts. But I guess for me it was a little bit different because we had a course at Kiev-Mohyla Academy, which was called American Pragmatism, if I'm not mistaken. And we were kind of trying to translate some texts there as well, but it was rather done without any support, or like we were just translating and that's it. So it was like, thank you to Ivan for making these classes and all the discussion we had on each and every text, because it was really helpful to do the translation later on your own. But yeah, yes.
Okay. Yeah, and Davidson is also one of those philosophers who were inspired by Sellars' empiricism and the philosophy of mind, even so he developed it in rather different directions that you did.
It's true, and though Sellars is my particular hero, no one would suggest him as a model of philosophical style in writing, whereas Davidson is a wonderful philosophical writer.
Okay, thanks. And then Maria Lobac. Maria also studied philosophy at Kiev-Mohyla University, and she translated Richard Rorty, so one of your doctoral advisors. So Maria, please tell us.
Yes,
what was your
hello,
experience?
Mr. Brandom. It's very nice to meet you. Of course, Ivan has put a lot of pressure on me after telling me that I chose Rorty, and he was your academic advisor, and he warned me that I had to be very careful with my work, and I am, but I definitely think that I'm probably more lucky than my colleagues, as I think Rorty writes pretty eloquently, like quite understandably, and I translate, well, I have been translating two of his essays. One is an essay called Solidarity. It's quite different from pragmatism topic as it is, but it still was quite interesting to look into his like more moral aspects. And also my second article that I'm translating is Incorrigibility as a Mark of the Mental. Yeah, and it's quite a journey, to be honest, and there are a lot to take in while I'm working. I also doing a lot of research, and as I studied in Kiev Mohyla Academy some time ago, it takes me a lot of time to to remind myself all the all the theories and dive into it. But it's very exciting to work with this text and to work in this environment, and I'm very happy that you're here, and I'm very happy to meet you, and that you also can enlighten us a little bit in the topic. I'm very thankful for that. Thank you.
Well, very good. The incorrigibility and the mark of the mental is something like the article that made Rorty's career, but it is not his best writing. The later pieces are much better when he found his style.
But so, like in making it explicit, you actually use and refer to this quite important. It's like I choose it because of that. Okay, and last but not least, Bogdan, who is also a doctoral student at the Ivan Franko National University in Lviv, and he actually translated your 3 essays. And Bogdan, please share with us your experiences.
Yes. Hello, Mr. Brandom. Speaking about pressure that Maria mentioned, it's kind of pressure to speak with the person you're translating, actually. But we, with Ivan, choose and translated 3 essays. It's asserting, it's Kantian lessons about mind, meaning, and rationality, and the last one, freedom and constraint by norms. What can I say? Actually, it is quite interesting essays, actually, with quite interesting argument. Also, as I see and as I know from some researching, I still in the process of researching of your philosophy, but they present some kind of changing in your thought, because as I see, like the asserting and the last 2 essays, they have some development of your mind, of your ideas. And actually, translating of your works was kind of experience, because actually it is the first like global philosophical translations for me, because before it I had only some experience with one that Wittgenstein essay, some remarks on logical form, and it is actually in the process of editing, lost in the process of editing, but still. And thanks to Ivan and all the Междухома Foundation, we started working with this new Pragmatism project, and my choice of your articles actually was just some kind of blind choice, because I was not very good in this whole topic of pragmatism. So what was interesting for me is that you combined the continental philosophy, some aspects of continental philosophy of Kant's ideas, and actually this pure American tradition of pragmatism. So it was actually my reasons for choosing your articles. And now, actually, I hope we will have some discussion in the end.
Well, thank you very much. And no, this is a wonderful project. It's near and dear to my heart. I'm very glad to be able to contribute in any way to it.
Okay, thank you. Now you can start with your talk.
Okay, well, given the background you've described, I suppose a good deal of what I'll want to say is familiar. I want to talk about classical American pragmatism, but from Rorty's point of view. particularly the point of view of his Girona lectures from 97, just a decade before his death. I think he came to a new way of thinking about American pragmatism that I find very enlightening, and that's what I'd like to talk about. And this was seeing American pragmatism beginning already with Peirce, but followed out particularly by his hero, Dewey, as nothing less than a second Enlightenment. And I want to talk in particular about the way Rorty picks up and develops a line of thought that he finds in Dewey, elaborating it into a distinctive anti-authoritarian, anti-fetishist version of a specifically pragmatist second Enlightenment. Sometimes he talks about it as completing, as the second phase that completes the first Enlightenment. But before talking about that redescription of his, I want to fill in some of the background picture of how the classical American pragmatism that took shape 100 years before Rorty was writing can already be seen as enacting a second Enlightenment. The story I'm going to tell, I think Rorty largely takes for granted. He never explicitly lays it out in the terms that I will, but I think it both strengthens his case and highlights his contribution to the tradition that he both inherits from his American pragmatist heroes and retrospectively rationally reconstructs in order to read it as learning, as teaching the lessons that he thinks we should learn from it. So the story I'm going to outline is broad, but I think it's a recognizable characterization of the constellation of ideas, particularly that Peirce bequeaths to James and Dewey, and through them to Rorty, and that I have gathered from him. The motor of the first Enlightenment was, of course, the rise of the new science, in particular, the mathematized physics of Galileo, Descartes, and Newton. The philosophical project that was animated by the spectacular achievements of natural science centered on the question, what should the fact that these new empirical and theoretical practices turn out to be the best way to understand the non-human world, what do they teach us about the nature of that world? What do they teach us about what knowledge and understanding of that world consists in? And what do they teach us about ourselves as knowers in that sense of that world and agents in the world as the new science revealed it to be? Because their thought was principally oriented by this project, I think all of the canonical early modern philosophers, from Descartes to Kant, can sensibly be understood as, in the first instance, philosophers of science. The questions they asked were set by the rise of the new science. And the physical science that they were inspired by and were interpreters of, culminating in Newton's physics, put forward mathematical theories in the form of impersonal, immutable principles, formulating universal, eternal, necessary laws of nature. Enlightenment empiricism, on the side of theories of knowledge, sought to ground all of our knowledge in self-contained, self-intimating sensory episodes, whose brute occurrence is the most basic kind of knowing, what Sellers called derisively the given. Just how the natural light of reason could extract and secure certain knowledge of things as law governed from those deliverances of fallible perception was a perennial puzzle. And a further problem was fitting into the picture of the world as delivered by the best science of the time. The sensing, theorizing, and experimentally intervening scientific minds with which we were encouraged to identify ourselves. Hume described his own aspiration. He said he wanted to become the Newton of the mind by perfecting Locke's theoretical efforts to understand psychological processes of understanding in terms of mechanisms of association and abstraction. But the issue of how the subject of that science was to be found among the furniture of the universe described by the real Newton, the original Newton, was an apparently intractable philosophical embarrassment. You couldn't find Hume's mind in Newton's world. And the founding genius of American pragmatism, Charles Sanders Peirce, like those original early modern Enlightenment philosophes, was above all, and in the first instance, a philosopher of science. And he too took as his basic philosophical project the task of explaining what the best science of his time taught us, on the one hand, ontologically about the ultimate nature of the world we live in, and epistemologically about the character of the best understanding of it as epitomized by that science, and how they fit together, how the universe as the science of Peirce's time understood it could be understood to grow knowers like us. But the contemporary sciences that provided Peirce's master ideas were very different from those that set the agenda for 17th and 18th century philosophers. Peirce was impressed by the broadly selectional forms of explanation that he presciently saw as common to Darwinian evolutionary biology at the level of species and the later psychological theories of learning at the level of individual organism. He saw that there was a common structure to those evolutionary explanations and explanations by learning, a matter of selection of some, what he came to call habits out of others. And Peirce was also impressed by the new forms of statistical explanation that were both essential to the new 19th century physical science of thermodynamics and became increasingly central to the new social sciences of the late 19th century. And a principal feature that distinguished both the selectional and the statistical forms of explanation and distinguished them from the Newtonian model of explaining particular occurrences by deriving them from or subsuming them under universal laws, is that the new sciences, as Peirce understood, instead of explaining, making intelligible what actually happened by showing that it had to happen, that it was necessary, the new methodologies, the selectional and statistical, made it possible to explain events that are acknowledged to be contingent and merely probable. Things could have happened otherwise, but we can still make sense of why they did happen this way. Accounts that appeal to natural selection in biology or to supervised selection in learning or to statistical likelihood, whether in physics or sociology or economics, all show how observed order can arise contingently but intelligibly, explicably, out of an irregular background of random variation as the cumulative result of individually random contingent happenings. Say the origin of this was just in thermodynamics, describing how the gas laws could be derived from and understood in terms of the random movements of gas particles. Peirce saw this as nothing less than a new form of intelligibility that the 19th century science had provided. Understanding whose paradigm is Darwin's evolutionary theory is a concrete, situated narrative of local, contingent, mutable, practical reciprocal accommodations of particular creatures and habitats. And Peirce speculatively generalized this model to a vision in which even the most fundamental laws of physics are to be understood as contingently emerging by selectional processes from primordial indeterminateness. He saw the laws of nature as the product of a kind of evolution. No less than the behavior of biological organisms, those laws of nature he understands as adaptational habits, each of which is, in a statistical sense, relatively stable and robust, at least in the environment provided by the rest. So for Peirce, the old forms of scientific explanation, paradigmatically Newton, appear as special limiting cases of these new ways of understanding things. The now restricted validity of appeal to laws and universal principles is for him explicable against the wider background provided by the new scientific paradigm of how regularity can arise out of and be sustained by variability. The calm realm of laws of the first Enlightenment and Newton's physics becomes for the second Enlightenment a dynamic population of habits, winnowed from a larger universe of habits, the ones that we see having so far escaped extinction by maintaining a more or less fragile collective self-reproductive equilibrium. Peirce thought that since laws of nature emerge only statistically, they can change. After all, no Darwinian adaptation is final, for the environment it's adapting to might change, indeed must eventually change in response to other Darwinian adaptations. And the relatively settled, fixed properties of things, their habits, as Peirce and Dewey would say, are themselves to be understood just as such adaptations. Peirce was a naturalist, but through the lens of then contemporary science, he confronted a new sort of nature, a nature that's fluid, stochastic, with regularities being the statistical products of many particular contingent interactions between things and their ever-changing environments. Hence, emergent and potentially evanescent. He saw those laws as habits that float statistically on a sea of chaos. Like many of the philosophers of the original Enlightenment, Peirce combined ontological naturalism of his new statistical selectional kind with epistemological empiricism. Like them, too, Peirce and his immediate pragmatist followers subscribed to Wilfrid Sellars' scientia mensura doctrine. Sellars had said, in the dimension of describing and explaining, science is the measure of all things, of those that they are, and of those that are not, that they are not. It's the end of the scientia mensura passage. And for both groups, science is not just one sort, but the very form of knowing. What it knows not is not knowledge. But just as Peirce's was a naturalism based on a radically different conception of nature, so his empiricism was based on a radically different conception of experience. The science to which the later pragmatist Enlightenment looked for its inspiration had changed since that of the earlier in more than just the conceptual resources and distinctive new forms of scientific intelligibility that it offered to its philosophical interpreters and admirers. In the 17th and the 18th centuries, the impact of science was largely a matter of its theories. Its devotees dreamed of, predicted, and planned for great social and political transformations that they saw the insights of the new sciences as prefiguring and preparing. But during this period, those new ways of thinking centered around the scientific revolution were largely devoid of immediate practical consequences. But by the middle of the 19th century, through technology, the practical arm of science, technology had changed the world radically and irrevocably through the Industrial Revolution, kind of practical echo, technological echo of the scientific revolution in theories. From the vantage point of established industrial capitalism, science appeared as the most spectacularly successful social institution of the previous 200 years, because it had become not only a practice, but a business. Its practical successes paraded as the warrant of its claims to theoretical insight. Technology, the pragmatists saw, embodies understanding. The more general philosophical lessons the pragmatists drew from science for an understanding of the nature of reason and its central role in human life accordingly sought to comprehend intellectual understanding as an aspect of effective agency, to situate knowing that, some claim is true, in the larger field of knowing how to do something. The sort of explicit reason that can be codified in principles appears as just one, often dispensable, expression of the sort of implicit intelligence that can be exhibited in skillful, because experienced, practice, flexible, adaptable habit that's emerged in a particular environment by selection via a learning process. Thinking of scientific practices primarily from the side of technology rather than theory is the key to the pragmatists' updated version of empiricism. For them, the unit of experience is a whole test, operate, test, exit cycle of perception, action, and further perception of the results of action. On this model, experience is not an input to the process of learning. Experience is the process of learning. It's the statistical emergence by selection of behavioral variants that survive and become habits insofar as they are, in company with their fellows, adaptive in the environments in which they are successively and successfully exercised. For the pragmatists, the rationality of science is best epitomized not in the occasion of the theorist's sudden intellectual glimpse of some aspect of the true nature of reality, but rather in the process by which the skilled practitioner coaxes usable observations by experimental intervention, crafts theories by inferential postulation and extrapolation, and dynamically works out a more or less stable but always evolving accommodation between the provisional results of those observational, experimental, and theoretical enterprises. The distinctive pragmatist shift in imagery for the mind is not from the mirror to the lamp, said that has been an image for the move from Enlightenment to Romanticism, but rather from the telescope and the microscope to the flywheel governor. These new pragmatist forms of naturalism and empiricism, updated so as to be responsive to the changed character and circumstances of 19th century science, meshed with each other far better than their predecessor forms of naturalism and empiricism had. As I mentioned, early modern philosophers notoriously had trouble fitting human knowledge and agency into its mechanist, materialist version of the natural world. A Cartesian chasm opened up between the activity of the theorist, whose understanding consists in the manipulation of algebraic symbolic representings, and what is thereby understood, the extended geometrical world represented by those symbols. That's the original Cartesian dilemma. This was precisely the gap that Descartes' concept of representation was designed to fill. Rorty always thought of pragmatism as the alternative to that representational picture. Its difficulties in doing so, the difficulty of using the notion of representation to connect the representing with the represented, the mind with the world, are what raised the specter of skepticism in early modern philosophy. The difficulty for the philosophers of the first Enlightenment was that understanding, discovering, and acting on principles exhibited for them one kind of intelligibility. Matter, moving according to eternal, mathematically expressible laws, exhibited a completely different kind of intelligibility. On the pragmatist understanding, though, knower and the known are alike explicable by appeal to the same general mechanisms that bring order out of chaos, settled habit out of random variation, namely the statistical selective structure shared by processes of evolution and of learning. That selectional structure ties together all the members of a great continuum of being, stretching from the processes by which physical regularities emerge through those by which the organic evolves locally and temporarily stable forms, through the learning processes by which the animate acquire locally and temporarily adaptive habits, to the intelligence of untutored common sense of ordinary language users, and ultimately to the methodology of the scientific theorist, which the pragmatists understood as just the explicit, systematic refinement of the implicit, unsystematic, but nonetheless intelligent procedures characteristic of everyday practical life. For the first time, the rational practices embodying the paradigmatic sort of reason exercised by scientists understanding natural processes, becomes visible as continuous with and intelligible in just the same terms as the physical processes paradigmatic of what's understood. And it's that unified version of what there is to be understood and the understanding of it that stands at the center of the classical American pragmatists' second Enlightenment. And this happy concord and consilience between the distinctively pragmatist versions of naturalism in ontology and empiricism in epistemology stands in stark contrast not only to the prior traditional British empiricism of the Enlightenment, but also to the subsequent 20th century logical empiricism of the Vienna Circle. The reductive physicalist version of naturalism and the reductive phenomenalist version of empiricism that the Vienna Circle inclined to endorse were exceptionally difficult to reconcile with each other, just as the original Enlightenment version were. Hume had already shown how difficult it is to provide suitable empiricist credentials for the way in which mathematical laws supporting subjunctive reasoning, the crowning glory of Newtonian physics, outrun observable regularities, not only epistemically, but even semantically. Adding the powerful methods of modern logic, as we do in the 20th century, to articulate the phenomenal deliverances of sense didn't alter this fundamental mismatch. A threatening and recalcitrant tension accordingly concerned how to proceed when respect for the deliverances of natural science as the measure of what there is and how it is in nature collides with empiricist strictures on what we're entitled to claim to know, on when we're entitled to claim to know what there is and how it is. So in the Vienna Circle, Otto Neurath thought that naturalism should prevail when it collided with empiricism. And Moritz Schlick thought that empiricism should prevail when it collided with naturalism. And Rudolf Carnap struggled mightily to keep these two wings of the movement from just flying off in different directions. And in spite of his many pragmatist corrections to and emendations of his hero Carnap, even Quine could never quite bring into harmony his own scientific naturalism and his residual empiricism, for instance, in his hostility to modality. According to this way of construing the tradition, Peirce initiated the American pragmatist school of philosophical thought already as a second Enlightenment, centered, as the first had been, on new conceptions of reason and models of intelligibility drawn from the best contemporary scientific achievements. Rorty, looking back at this, thinks that Dewey added to the reconception of both knowers and the known that Peirce had bequeathed a further substantial element inspired by and modeled on the First Enlightenment's principal theme, its principal advance in practical philosophy, its secularizing and humanizing disenchantment of traditional theologically based ethics. Dewey, according to Rorty, picked up this practical side of the original Enlightenment. Peirce had provided a constructive alternative to the spectatorial picture of knowing as mirroring nature. But in his Girona period, Rorty draws from Dewey the leading idea and basic conceptual raw materials for a critique of Enlightenment philosophy's basic orienting representationalist semantic paradigm. He saw the critique that he now envisaged as more radical and fundamental than the line Rorty had pursued in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, where he diagnosed that paradigm as inevitably precipitating a sterile oscillation between foundationalism on the one side and skepticism on the other in epistemology. Astonishingly, Rorty in the Girona period would criticize the Enlightenment understanding of cognition in terms of representation as a politically objectionable form of authoritarianism. He took himself thereby to be following Dewey in turning the Enlightenment's own devastating practical critique of received religion against its own dominant theoretical strategy for understanding cognition. Thought of this way, pragmatism, as Rorty wants us to understand it, just consists in following out the First Enlightenment's own best insights and principal achievements to their logical conclusion, completing its humanistic transformation of our philosophical self-conception. The central strand of the original Enlightenment thought that Rorty takes over as the fixed end of his analogy extends Kant's characterization in Was ist Aufklärung. The Enlightenment, for Kant, marks the end of humanity's self-imposed tutelage, the achievement of our majority and maturity, for the first time taking adult responsibility for our own character and destiny. It's our emancipation from submission to the alien, non-human because superhuman authority of God as old Nobodaddy in matters of our practical conduct. Henceforth, we should deem it incompatible with our human dignity to understand ourselves as subject to any laws other than those that we have in one way or another laid down for ourselves. No longer should our ideas about what is right and good be understood to have been dictated to us by a superhuman authority. That's what Rorty thinks of as the central practical achievement of the Enlightenment. The deep Enlightenment insight on this line of thought was the diagnosis of what Marx, following Hegel, would later call fetishism, concerning the practical norms that we acknowledge and identify with as making us what we are. Fetishism, in this sense, is mistaking the products of our own practices and practical attitudes for features of the objective world that are what they are independent of and antecedent to those practices and attitudes. Marx's favorite example was the traditional conception of the value of precious metals, which thought of the value of metals the same way it thought of as their density. So that there was, for instance, an objectively correct answer to the question of how many ounces of silver are really worth, objectively worth, as much as 1 ounce of gold. The First Enlightenment, as Rorty construed it, concerned our emancipation from non-human authority in practical matters, issues of what we ought to do and how things ought to be. The envisaged second enlightenment is to apply this basic lesson to our emancipation from non-human authority, even in theoretical cognitive matters. Here, the non-human authority in question is not that of God, but a particular conception of objective reality. The philosophical conception Rorty liked to write with a capital R. In an essay published in English a few years after the Girona lectures, called Pragmatism as Anti-Authoritarianism, Rorty summarized the view that he'd announced there. He said, "There's a useful analogy to be drawn between the pragmatist's critique of the idea that truth is a matter of correspondence to the intrinsic nature of reality, and the Enlightenment's criticism of the idea that morality is a matter of correspondence to the will of a divine being. The pragmatist's anti-representationalist account of belief is, among other things, a protest against the idea that human beings must humble themselves before something non-human, whether that's the will of God or the intrinsic nature of reality." End of that quote. Rorty adds that seeing anti-representationalism as a version of anti-authoritarianism permits one to appreciate an analogy that was central to John Dewey's thought, namely the analogy between ceasing to believe in sin and ceasing to believe in reality. The connection is that, quote, the representationalist tradition in philosophy, which was dominant in those 400 years, hoped that inquiry would put us in touch, if not with the eternal, at least with something which, in Bernard Williams' phrase, is there anyway, something non-perspectival, something which is what it is apart from human needs and interests. William James, the pragmatist, had countered that picture of an objective reality, saying, "The trail of the human serpent is over all." And by contrast, still with Rorty, what Dewey most disliked about both traditional realist epistemology and about traditional religious belief is that they discourage us by telling us that somebody or something has authority over us, all of us. Both tell us that there's something inscrutable, something towards which we have duties, duties which have precedence over our cooperative attempts to avoid pain and obtain pleasure. Again, Dewey was convinced that the romance of democracy, a romance built on the idea that the point of human life is free cooperation with fellow humans, required a more thoroughgoing version of secularism than either Enlightenment rationalism or 19th century positivism had achieved. As Dewey saw it, wholehearted pursuit of the democratic ideal requires us to set aside any authority, save that of the consensus of our fellow community members and human beings. Eduardo Mendieta says of the lesson of these lectures in his introduction to his book of Rorty essays called, after a quote of Rorty's, "Take care of freedom and the truth will take care of itself." Lovely passage that he used as the title of the book. Mendieta says, "In the end, Rorty's adamant skepticism and anti-dogmatism are simply ways to be anti-authoritarian and irreverently anti-fetishistic. There is no supreme power that can offer an alibi, a warrant, or a proof for our claims and beliefs. There isn't anything but fallible human authority. There is no supreme authority other than the authority of human justification and reasons, whose only power is the power of persuasion." Rorty's call for a second pragmatist enlightenment, completing the first, is a Hegelian extrapolation of the original Kantian understanding of enlightenment, extending the application of that conception from ethics to encompass also semantics and epistemology. But I think it's worth filling in the argument behind this subsumption of semantic anti-representationalism, that side of pragmatism, under the banner of humanistic Enlightenment anti-authoritarianism. that's to use political arguments in epistemology. This is one of the lessons Rorty thought we should learn from pragmatism. In its largest structure, I think the movement of thought Rorty is recommending consists of two moves: a Kantian appreciation of the normative character of representational relations, and a Hegelian social pragmatism about normativity in general. So let me say something about those. The first is part and parcel of Kant's radical recasting of Descartes' division of things into minds and bodies. Kant recasts that in terms of the distinction between norms and causes. Because Kant reconceives discursive intentionality, what he calls apperception, we can think of as sapience. Kant reconceives that as a normative phenomenon. What principally distinguishes for Kant judgments and intentional actions from the responses of merely natural creatures is not that they stem from mind stuff. It's that judgments and actions are things that we're in a distinctive sense responsible for. They express commitments of ours. They're exercises of our authority. Knowers and agents are responsible for how they take things to be and make things to be. Candidate knowings and doings express commitments as to how things are or shall be. The distinction between us and it, for Kant, is a distinction between those of us who live and move and have our being in a normative space and things that live and move and have their being only in a causal space. Knowings and doings are exercises of a distinctive kind of authority, the authority to commit oneself, to make oneself responsible. This, for Kant, is the authority to bind oneself by rules in the form of concepts that discursive beings apply in judging and intending. Merely natural creatures are bound by rules only in the form of laws of nature, not rules they've bound themselves by. That's the difference between norms and causes. Discursive beings are bound by rules they bind themselves by, concepts they apply, which are rules determining what they have thereby made themselves responsible to and for. Their normative statuses, responsibilities, commitments, are instituted by their attitudes of undertaking or acknowledging those commitments. This is Kantian autonomy, and it's the essence of Kantian rationality. It's a distinctive normative sort of freedom, which Kant develops by taking Rousseau's definition of freedom. Rousseau in The Social Contract says, obedience to a law one has prescribed oneself is freedom. And Kant takes that Rousseauian definition of freedom and turns it into a criterion of demarcation for genuine normative bindingness. One is genuinely normatively bound only by rules that one has, in some sense, bound oneself by. One of the principal grounds on which, in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, Rorty condemns then contemporary analytic philosophy as still in thrall to Kantian conceptions is the central role that Kant gives to the concept of representation, following Descartes, in understanding the contentfulness of thought and experience. I think that in his later critique of representationalism in semantics, on the basis of a more thoroughgoing and general version of Enlightenment anti-authoritarianism, Rorty follows Hegel in focusing on the rulishness of Kant's conception of representation. For Hegel reads Kant as offering a normative conception of the notion of representation as a way of filling in Kant's normative notion of intentionality. Kant dug down below the Cartesian epistemological concerns about the warrant for our confidence in the success of our representational undertakings to uncover the underlying semantic understanding of representational purport that they presuppose. So where Descartes had been an epistemological skeptic about whether we actually knew anything, Kant saw that underneath that there was a deeper threat of semantic skepticism. How is it we can even think about things, rightly or wrongly? Where Descartes just takes for granted the representational purport of our thought, construing as something we immediately know just by having thoughts at all, he takes for granted, Descartes does, the notion that our ideas are tanquam rem, as if of things. But Kant asks, what is it about our thoughts in virtue of which they so much as seem to represent something else, purport to point beyond themselves to something that they're of or about, that they represent? And one lesson that Hegel learns from Kant, as I understand him, is that a representing is as such responsible to what it represents for assessments of its correctness in a distinctive sense, its correctness as a representing of that represented. Put another way, what's represented exercises authority over what count as representings of it, just in virtue of its serving as the standard that those representings are responsible to for their assessment of correctness as representings. Thinking of representation in terms of the authority of the representing, the authority of the represented over the representings, the responsibility of the representings to what's represented, this is a radical normative reconceptualization of the relations between representeds and representings. And it's of the essence of Hegel's reading of Kant that he understands Kant's notion of representation as part and parcel of Kant's normative transformation and his understanding of us. And as I want to understand Rorty's late anti-representationalism as anti-authoritarianism, Rorty's longstanding social pragmatism about normativity comes into play because of this Hegelian normative understanding of representation in terms of the authority of objective representeds over subjective representings of it. So what do I mean by Rorty's social pragmatism about normativity? That's the view. Pragmatism in this sense is the claim that normative statuses, paradigmatically responsibility, commitment, entitlement, are always and everywhere features of the role something plays in social practices. Normativity is a product of the role things play in our social practices. Norms are creatures of our practices, instituted by our practical attitudes, how we take or treat things in practice. Apart from their involvement in such practices, there are no normative proprieties, only natural properties. This is a social Hegelian version of a central Enlightenment idea. Samuel Pufendorf had theorized about what he called the imputation of normative characteristics of things, the way they acquire this new sort of normative significance by playing a suitable role in our practices. Social contract theories of political obligation look for the origins of normative statuses of political authority and responsibility in practical attitudes of contracting and consenting. By contrast to traditional ideas of an objective natural or supernatural order of normative superiority and subordination, the scala natura, the great chain of being. By contrast to that picture where the norms are baked into the way things objectively are, the distinctively modern idea is that there were no statuses of authority and responsibility, no superiors and subordinates, and until we started taking or treating each other as authoritative and responsible, as entitled to command and obliged to obey. So I want to claim that Rorty's radical, distinctive form of contemporary pragmatism is the result of critiquing representationalist conceptions by first understanding them in normative terms and then understanding those normative terms in terms of roles that things play in social practices. Representation on this account is not a natural relation, it's a normative one. It's part of what the trail of the human serpent is all over. According to Rorty's radicalized version of social pragmatism about norms, the very idea of objective things as exercising epistemic authority over our attitudes, which is underwritten by the semantic idea of represented serving as normative standards, authoritative for assessments of the correctness of what count as representings of them, just in virtue of being responsible to those representeds for such assessments. That notion, according to Rorty, is deeply and irremediably confused, because in the end, all authority is communal authority. Further, the critical function of reason as legitimating norms, as understood by the Enlightenment and made most fully explicit by Kant, teaches that we can only genuinely be responsible to each other, to what we can engage in conversation, to what we can give justifying reasons to, and in turn demand justifying reasons from. So the way Rorty understands Kant's version of the Enlightenment is that all authority derives from our practices of giving and demanding reasons from each other. The very notion of something being authoritative that isn't in conversation with us, that we can't demand its reasons for acting the way it does, that notion is fundamentally confused for him. This radicalization of social pragmatism about norms is now explicitly construed in political terms of freedom and dignity. Rorty says, only in a democratic society, which describes itself in pragmatist terms, one can imagine Dewey saying, is the refusal to countenance any authority save that of consensus reached by free inquiry complete. This is the standpoint from which growing out of acknowledging the overriding practical authority of an objective supernatural lawgiver, on the one hand, and growing out of acknowledging the overriding cognitive authority of an objective natural represented reality, come to seem to Rorty to be two sides of one coin. And it's a lesson he takes himself to have learned from Hegel via Dewey. Rorty says, quote, this is because Dewey was the most historically minded, the one who learned from Hegel how to tell great sweeping stories about the relation of the human present to the human past, what Rorty elsewhere talks about as great swooshy geistesgeschichtlich narratives. Dewey's stories are always stories of the progress from the need of human communities to rely on a non-human power to their realization that all they need is faith in themselves. They're stories about the substitution of fraternity for authority. Dewey's stories about history, as the story of increasing freedom, are stories about how we lost our sense of sin and also our hope of another world, and gradually acquired the ability to find the same spiritual significance in cooperation between finite mortals that our ancestors had found in their relation to an immortal being. End of the Rorty quote. The incipient pragmatist emancipation that Rorty is working toward is the substitution of a pragmatics of rational consensus for the semantics of representation. For Rorty, all we can do is give and ask for reasons with each other. Authority and responsibility are creatures of those discursive practices. We should accordingly, for Rorty, reject the idea that our discursive practices answer to, are responsible to, or need acknowledge the authority of anything outside those practices and the practical attitudes of those who engage in them. The constraint of the objective world on our practices for Rorty should be understood as exclusively causal, not normative. It's important to keep this contrast in mind. Contrast between the causal and the normative forms of constraint. Like his hero Dewey, Rorty never questioned the utility and importance of a basically ecological conception of reality as the natural environment with which we must cope and within which we must flourish as biological and social organisms. This is the stubborn, recalcitrant reality that causally constrains, challenges, frustrates, and rewards our practical undertakings. The messy retail process of improving our habits and attunements is, Rorty thinks, fully describable in a wholly naturalistic vocabulary. What he objects to is the philosophical concept he designates as reality with the capital R, distinguished by that mock honorific capital letter. This is the notion of something that has a distinctive kind of semantic and epistemic authority over the correctness of our sayings and thinkings. Reality, it's the notion of reality as something we're responsible to in a way that transcends and constrains our linguistic, social, justificatory practices of giving and asking for reasons from the outside, just by reality being what it is. That's the conception he rejects. The functional explanatory role that conception of reality plays, the status reality has with respect to us and our practices, is something that must be specified in normative terms. That's the Rortian lesson. There's no small irony in the absolutely central and essential role that the Kantian distinction between norms and causes, reasons and facts, those are Kantian distinctions, norms and causes, reasons and facts. There's no small irony in the absolutely central and essential role that Kantian distinction plays in Rorty's thought. It's the overriding distinction that shapes his criticism of the analytic philosophers that he casts as 20th century neo-Kantians. He aims to use Kantian conceptual tools to undercut the Kantian conception of the philosophical project. That's his pragmatism. Thank you.
Oh. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks. Okay, guys. Do we have any questions? Because I do have some questions, especially to this paper, Bob's paper, The Pragmatist Enlightenment. And but I would like to give you a chance to ask a question. Bogdan.
Maybe you can
Marie.
start and we will follow them.
Okay, so basically, Bob, I have when I was reading many years ago, and your paper, The Pragmatist Enlightenment, which was published 20 years ago, 2004, and yeah, and today you actually used some ideas from that paper, especially about this. I will quote now. It's in the PDF. I have page 9. When you say, in the practical sphere of morality, the European Enlightenment had taught us that we need not think of our moral principles as deriving their authority from the conformity to, mirroring of, an antecedent, internal, non-human, ontological, or theological reality. And you're talking here always about this practical sphere. And to be honest with you, this course I mentioned in the beginning of our today's meeting, I taught at Ukrainian Catholic University on philosophies of enlightenment. So the basic idea behind that course was that the enlightenment, the first enlightenment, as you put it, is the overcoming of transcendence, both in epistemology and in practical philosophy, or in a practical sphere. Because, when you're talking, for instance, about British empiricism, about Locke, or for instance about Berkeley, yeah, then of course we can say that epistemology was not free from this non-human reality as some kind of antecedent. But when we're talking about Kant, yeah, and you actually in the second half of today's talk, you actually pointed it out. But when we're talking about Kant, the whole achievement of his Critique of Pure Reason was like to show that we do not need any kind of God, of non-human internal reality, in order to justify our epistemic and normative attitudes towards the world, not only in practical sphere, but also in this, so to say, theoretical sphere. And it's not only like Kant in 18th century. When we look into Vica's account of the new science, or even in case of Hume, it's not so clear. So, and how would you?
Well, I think, you know, I agree with that. That if you read the original Enlightenment philosophers roughly the way Hegel taught us to read them, they are the pragmatists. They're doing the same thing that the pragmatists are doing. It's a recentering of things for which Kant's image of the Copernican revolution is appropriate. To see the crucial features of our knowledge no less than the crucial features of our practical conduct as reflecting how it is with us, rather than reflecting the imposition of some alien, intrinsically unintelligible reality on us. So I agree with you, in fact, that the original Enlightenment had both of these aspects. Now, the practical rejection of understanding moral normativity in terms of obedience to a supernatural Lord, that took. We by and large live in that modern world, that post-Enlightenment world. In our practical thinking, of course, there are the triumph of Enlightenment in that regard is partial and local, but that was the lesson that people learned from the Enlightenment. The theoretical side, not so much. What people most rejected in Kant was his transcendental idealism, was precisely his claim that nature was empirically real, reflected our cognitive capacities, was precisely not some objective alien thing constraining us. That's the part of Kant that was rejected. And in Hegel's rejection of it, well, we rejected Hegel even more, I want to say, than the Kantian transcendental idealism. The critique of traditional religion, as I say, stuck. That's not going away, even if its triumph is not yet complete. But by and large, nobody saw how to pick up that theme that in the original Enlightenment, that I think you're right, it came to its culmination in Kant every bit as much as the practical did. Nobody saw how to make sense of that. It was an embarrassment to readers of Kant. It's the reason it was Kant's practical philosophy rather than his theoretical philosophy that was, by the 20th century, influential. So I think there's a lot of justice in Rorty's claim that part of the Enlightenment needs to be, that lesson of the Enlightenment needs to be relearned, needs to be retaught, needs to be reconceptualized in a way in which people can see that it's not some crazy Berkeleyan idealism.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's funny that you mentioned Berkeley, because actually I do not remember whether I mentioned it, but I actually scholarly edited Ukrainian translation of Berkeley's works. And yeah, and I suffered through all this God stuff in his treatise on principles of human knowledge. But you know, like to continue.
The Irish poet Yeats referred to his compatriot, Berkeley, of course, was Irish, as God-intoxicated Berkeley, who proved all things a dream, that this big farrowing pig of a world that doth so solid seem would vanish in an instant if the mind but change its theme. That was his appreciation of Berkeley.
Yeah, and actually, like Kant in Transcendental Dialectics, he actually breaking out the idea of God, showing its insignificance for theoretical philosophy and so on and so forth, even though, like in his late works, for instance, after the Three Critics, the biggest book he published after the Three Critics, it was like this Religionsschrift, so-called, Die Religion innerhalb der Grenzen der bloßen Vernunft. And like in that work, he actually had to deal with like social consequences of his theoretical philosophy, because of the accusations of atheism and so on and so forth. So he had somehow to reconcile his theoretical philosophy with religion and with his zeitgeist, so to say. Yeah.
Well, and Hegel read a bootleg version of the Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone when he was in the theological Stift training as an undergraduate, and he and Hölderlin and Schelling passed around this copy that the fathers were not to know that they had, and wrote home in one of the earliest letters we have from him that Kant there is completely right, except that Fantasie, Herz, and Sinnlichkeit must not be sent empty away. And I think this shapes the difference in, epitomizes the difference in Hegel's treatment of religion, skeptical treatment of religion, as opposed to the Kantian one.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Anyone else? Any questions? Someone? Anyone? No? Oh.
Maybe I have a question. Actually, it's not a question. It's some kind of asking for commentary on your thoughts. When I was translating your essays, actually the one that was broadly referred here is freedom and constraint by norms. I had one.
Which, I mean, let me say that was one of my very early pieces. It was sort of the first version in which I came to appreciate this Kantian normative revolution.
I had a little question about, let's say, practical side of these ideas, because as a theoretical part, as some kind of model of human interaction, it is understandable, and it is actually very, let's say, sophisticated and structured system with all this commitment, enlightenment, or entitlement, responsibility, and so on. But when I was translating it, I thought about, let's say, how we can manage it in practice. And for me, it is possible, or let's say understandable, how to use it in some kind of small groups. For example, in a group of scientists, or in a group of, let's say, translators, or in maybe in some cases even some political groups or something like that. Like very, maybe not very, but in some case, some group of people with some limitations. But when I'm trying to think about it, for example, as for all humanity, or even for such a groups like, let's say, maybe a country, like just some broader groups, I struggle with the idea how to make it working. Actually, let's say subconsciously, I understand that this model actually is built in our everyday life, but while it is subconscious, as for me, this idea is not broadly referred, and it may have some, let's say, some problems with its realization. So the idea is, like, the idea of my question, and yeah, the idea of my question will be like, if we try to make all this idea with authority and commitment, let's say, understandable for broad group of people, how it may be managed for them.
So, I sometimes find it helpful here to think of, I don't know, a cartoon version, really a caricature of Hegel's account of this, saying, if you think that our normative statuses, what we're committed to, what we're entitled to do, essentially depend on our own attitudes and the attitudes of those in our community, that normative substance is socially synthesized by reciprocal recognition, is a way to think about it, then we're a distinctive kind of being, because what we are in ourselves, what we really are, what we're, for instance, really committed to, depends on our normative attitudes, on what we take ourselves to be committed to. I mean, we can't just give ourselves entitlement by taking ourselves to have it, but apart from our attitudes individually and in our communities, it's those attitudes that are making us be what we really are. And that means that we can change what we really are by changing our practices, by changing the way we treat each other, by changing our attitudes. And that means we have to understand ourselves as essentially historical creatures. You can only understand us by looking at what we took ourselves to be and how that changed what we really were, and how that changed what we took ourselves to be, and that in turn changed what we really are. This picture of our making the norms that make us what we are by our interactions with each other, never having to start from scratch, from nothing, always coming into an already up and running community, but a community whose norms are nothing but what they were made by, previous time slices of our community, and understanding that the norms we bequeath to the next generations are the ones we make out of what we inherited. And to think of our social institutions, our political institutions, as the means for regulating and controlling this self-formative process, this process of becoming what we really are. Our institutions at sort of all levels are not ideal. They're not what we would like them to be. There's practical problems, to say, easier in a small group where we can give each other reasons and reject those reasons and sort things out. In the larger group where we can't all talk to each other, well, what institutions can we have to conduct this process of self-formation of all of us and of each of us? And the political institutions of liberal democracy, well, that's basically what we made of the first Enlightenment's idea of it. We said, well, we'll have this representative democracy. We see what's important and right and good about that. I read the passage about the Dewey on the romance of democracy as the form of our self-formation. But it's clearly early days in designing good institutions, good structures of community for mediating between the norms we inherit and the norms we bequeath, for changing these practices. But that's what Dewey and Rorty thought we should be thinking about, is how to improve those institutions. I don't know, that's very hand-wavy, but that's...
Yeah. And this is actually the task of intellectuals, of philosophers, trying to improve this. For instance, in our publishing house, we're preparing like Kant's minor works, like small papers he published in Berlinische Monatsschrift. And Berlinische Monatsschrift was not like...
Well, these ones he wrote for the public rather than for philosophers are very important.
Yeah, this is like Berlinische Monatsschrift. It wasn't like some kind of academic journal only for professional philosophers. It like the whole like Germans, educated Germans can read it and so on and so forth. Even so, the only essay he managed to write clearly, it was Aufklärungsessay. For instance, he also published in this Berlinische Monatsschrift was heißt sich im Denken orientieren? What is it? To orient oneself in thinking? Yeah, but this essay, this paper is quite hard to understand for like a non-professional philosopher. But still, he was trying to influence his public. So basically, and to change the institutions, as you...
And he theorized about that in the Streit of Fakultäten essay about what the difference between what the intellectuals should be doing with each other and what they should be, how they should be interacting with the public. So that he worried about theoretically and systematically about the difference between those audiences.
Yeah. Like this is...
Well, so all of this is theoretical background saying what you're doing is very important. And I'm pleased to have gotten to see you and say hello to you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? If not, so probably we can wrap it up.
Okay, well, thank you all then.
Thank you. And I stopped the recording, and